And I think that I learned a lot. Then we had an NYA project where we studied the Southern whites that migrated to Detroit. And I remember one fellow said he got a $100 paycheck, so he quit. He didn't think he needed any more money. Then he went back and got another job. Then it was kind of the offbeat stuff. We followed this group, was one of the, well, if you'd call religious right churches, and they were praying for what was then the Black Legion. And I think what I got to see, which people should realize now, is these people were very sincere in what they were doing. It's what they'd been brought up with. And I think there's just a tendency to just too much smear people without seeing where they're coming from. And I remember in Spokane, I do some of the offbeat things. This friend of mine, Smitty Myers, who was later dean at Gonzaga, we'd go down to the free speech debates. And I remember when we were to see courts, instead of going to the federal court, my friend and I went to the police court. I think we learned more four-letter words then. It was a little hard to report to the school on. So I think there was kind of the youth, there was kind of an adventuresomeness, and then a very independent feeling from both my parents. Maybe you could say it's pig-headed, but it was also a very, very independent feeling.
So you switched from engineering into what, sociology?
Into sociology, and then I got out of school. I was married after that, and there were no jobs. And I went to law school. It took undergraduate degree and $75 to get into law school. So that was a fairly simple thing to do.
Tell us about some of your classmates in law school.
Well, quite a few interesting ones. Well, Horace Gilmore's now a judge. Menon Williams is a year ahead of me. Martha and Hicks Griffiths were in the same class. Hicks was admitted to Harvard Law School, but at that time Harvard didn't let any women in. And the U of M didn't lock the door. There was Martha and the daughter of one of the professors, and we had one black in the class. So things have changed a lot since then. Then undergraduate, I knew Art Miller. We were in the same eating co-op together, the author. And some of the friends there, I had one Danny Suits, and he's now retired, lives about 10 minutes away from each other. So I'd say it's a very stimulating group.
After law school, you went to work for the WPA, I understand.
Yes.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, that was interesting. The first one, I got the job right out of school. I think they probably asked for some offbeat students or something. I was at WPA first for the adult education. And we worked, went where people were needed. A lot of the work was in the Polish Catholic basements, Negro funeral homes, and union halls. Then from there, I went to the WPA Workers' Service. And Joe Kowalski was in charge of that, later the Speaker of the House. And that was a very productive, some way the most satisfying. We were to teach workers their rights and responsibilities in the American form of government, and we trained the Willow Run employees how to be stewards. Remember, these were people that came up from the Deep South, had no understanding of unions, and I remember we teach the 4 W's of what, when, where, why, and then how, and how to fill out grievances. And it was a very educational. In fact, when I interviewed Irv Bluestone, Walter Reuther's assistant, he made the point that Walter was primarily, in addition to a union organizer, an educator. And there was a tremendous stimulation in that period. The sit-downs were over, the war was starting to get going, and it was a very, very satisfying experience. Didn't make much money, though.
And then with the outbreak of the war, you served in the Navy?
For a short time. I was in and out. I had some allergies, and I still have a little asthma, but and I was a company clerk for a while because I was the only one that could type. In fact, the first job I got out of high school was a clerk typist that got $1 a day. We worked a half day Saturday and got a full $1. And I think that's one reason I wanted to go to college. I never wanted to see a typewriter again. I just learned how to use a word processor in the last month or two.
Well, when you were discharged, then you went to work for the Ohio CIO?
Yeah, well, I worked, it's one of those forks in the road. I was offered the job of educational director at the West Side Local. That was Walter Reuther's local, and I probably would have worked up there. I offered the job in Ohio of legislative work, analyzing, appearing before legislative committees. I took that fork, and what was it, Yoga Berry said, when there's a fork in the road, take it. And then it was satisfying, but there's more dynamics in Detroit. And my then wife's sister and family were in the Detroit area, and after, I think, about 2 years, we went back to Detroit, and then I worked for Gus Scholl at that time.
So you joined the staff of the Michigan CIO and worked as Gus Scholl's assistant and as an attorney for the CIO.
Well, yes, I worked, I think I got past the bar later on, but I did a lot of the legislative work, did some of the analysis on the apportionment that we found Menon would, well, I can tell a couple of elections of Menon. His first real tough one was 48 in the primary, where there were 3 candidates. The CIO and Frank Martell from the Wayne County AFL supported Menon. The Teamsters supported another one, the Michigan AFL another. And Menon just squeaked through on that election, and we found the reason we did, we got people to run for precinct delegate, and they would have a slate the first time that had been done. Menon's name was on the slate. Then we had the fellow run and print great big letters, vote for your friend and neighbor. And we checked later, and those ones where we'd had people run as precinct delegate were the ones that gave, of course, a close election, everybody says they did it. So that was a close one. And then that was the one that really squeaked through. Then he would win sometimes by, I think 250,000, but the Senate would be against him. And at that time, Gus had me do some arithmetic on it, and more people voted for a Democrat for state senate than Republican, but you've done the work on apportionment that take 6 people, the districts varied from 60,000 to 360,000, so they were tilted against the Democrats. And Gus then had Ted Sachs do the legal work on that, and it took the U.S. and Michigan Supreme Courts about 3 years to catch up with Ted, but they really did.
Let's go back and talk about Gus Scholl, because Gus Scholl was such an important person in this period.
Well, Gus was quite a person. He was a high school dropout. He was a Depression product, but he had one of the keenest minds I know. And really what happened on the apportionment one, he said the courts would say you can't disenfranchise a person because they're Afro-American. You mean you can say that a stump equals a person, because he would make his talks that one person in the UP and 5 stumps equaled 1 voter in Detroit. He was quite dramatic on that. But he was very, very practical, very down to earth. Now what happened as far as the Democrat and Republican Party went, there'd been a hearing. I kind of want to jump a little bit to my good friend John Lovett. John Lovett represented the Michigan manufacturers. I kind of liked him. He'd call me a Walter Reuther socialist, I'd call him an anarchist, and from there on we'd go. And on ecology, he said, what are you going to do, fish or work? But he was, people thought he was anti-FEPC and racist. He wasn't. He was just against any government regulation. In fact, if there'd been a law you could only hire white males, he'd have come out against that. But he said, I remember he said, Tom, he said, you socialist Walter Reuther people will get, and Gus Scholl, you'll get the governor, maybe the House, the Supreme Court, but you'll never get the Senate. Well then, we had a big important unemployment comp bill. And I said to John, what are you going to do? Oh, in this kind of whiskey voice, not whiskey, but rats. Well, we'll give you a couple bucks a week. And I said, a couple of fish hooks? Yeah, and then next year a couple more. Yeah. Well, then General Motors was kind of a pig. They wanted it all at once. So they replaced him with Ray Smith. And we had a hearing in the state Senate, and there's something like 60 or 62 amendments, and they just rolled through that committee. Gus tried to testify. He had with him Abe Zwerdling, the UAW attorney, and they didn't get